After Carol Kennedy was found dead in her home, her husband Steve DeMocker became the prime suspect when his alibi could not be verified. He said he was on a long bike ride and his phone just happened to be dead for that entire time, and no one saw him. But did the police zero in on their suspect far too soon? I'm Charlie and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome back to Crimelines. If this is your first episode, back up a week because this is part 2 of the case. In the first part, we talked about Carol Kennedy's marriage to and divorce from Steve DeMocker and the events that led up to her being murdered in her own home. The police were looking at the ex-husband, Steve, as a suspect from day one. As we talked about last week, they were able to raise enough probable cause for warrants for Steve's condo, garage, and car. A search of Steve's condo and garage only yielded one clue: the cover to a Callaway No. 7 Big Bertha III golf club, which was a club they could prove that Steve had once bought, and he still had the cover for, but the club was nowhere to be found. The cover was seen in the garage in photos from the search, but when they went back to get it, it was also gone. The relevance of the club is that the ME ruled that the injuries to Carol's head were likely caused by an object like a golf club. For the police, this golf club cover and its disappearance was just more evidence against Steve. But there were two people who never doubted Steve's innocence, and they were Steve and Carol's two daughters, Katie and Charlotte. Katie was overseas at the time of her mother's death and flew back to the U.S. as soon as she could. She sat down with the investigators to talk on July 7th. They asked her about a couple of things, including a man named Jim Knapp. He was the man who rented out the guest house on Carol's property. He had been telling pretty much anyone who would listen that Steve was the one who killed Carol. Katie said that she thought Jim had some type of romantic interest in Carol, but it was definitely not reciprocated. And that's pretty much in line with what others have said. Jim seemed a bit infatuated with her, but she saw him just as a really good friend. But even with this possible unrequited love, Katie couldn't think of anyone who would have actually wanted to hurt Carol. So the police changed their question slightly and asked if there was anyone who just didn't like Carol or maybe was rude to her. And Katie mentioned a woman named Barb, who was Steve's assistant/girlfriend. And yes, their relationship, if you remember from last week, overlapped with the marriage. Steve had brought up Barb's name to Katie before this point because there were issues not just between Barb and Carol, but also Barb and Steve. The issue between the women was obvious enough. One was the wife and the other was the girlfriend during the marriage. Carol didn't really care for Barb, which was probably even one of the reasons she liked Steve's other girlfriend, Renee, so much, just by comparison. But with Steve and Barb, they were also dissolving their joint business relationship, and they disagreed about what percentage of the business was for Barb to take with her as an independent broker. She wanted half, and he thought 30% more reflected her role in growing their business. When Steve mentioned Barb in front of Katie, he said that Barb wouldn't have killed Carol herself, but maybe she would have hired someone to do it. Then she could get Carol out of the way, and if Steve went down for murder, she would also get all of his business. As a theory, this doesn't really make a ton of sense. Whoever committed this murder tried to make it look like an accident, which isn't what you would do if you were trying to frame someone for murder. And the main thing that made the police suspect Steve, that his phone was off during the time of the murder, wasn't in Barb's control. She didn't have a hand in any of the so-called framing. Barb's alibi was that she was at home, which is where most people are, on Wednesday evenings at 8 p.m. In checking Barb's phone records, her phone was actively pinging near her house, which is an hour away from the scene of the murder. And this wasn't just incoming calls or texts. If it was, you could just argue she left her phone at home. There was at least one outgoing text, so someone was using her phone at her house at the time of the murder, and it was very likely her. Steve's thought was that Barb wouldn't have killed Carol herself, but would have hired someone, but no evidence of that has been made public. There really was no evidence of her involvement, so it wouldn't have been easy to convince a judge to let them invade Barb's privacy by pulling bank statements to see if she paid anyone a lump sum or had she withdrawn a lot of cash suddenly, things that would rise to probable cause, which there really wasn't. The police also checked Jim Knapp's alibi. He said he had been at the guest house until around 1 or 2. He went over to Carol's house to let the dogs out, and then he went to a video rental place to pick up 2 movies, and then he went to a doctor's appointment. After that, he went to spend some time with his 2 sons, who were 13 and 11. According to his ex-wife, he arrived about 5:10. His older son had hockey practice, so he stayed at his ex-wife's house with their 11-year-old while she did the driving around. They turned on one of the movies Jim had rented, but the 11-year-old got bored partway through, so he left the room to go play a video game on his computer. When asked, Jim's son said he didn't have eyes on his dad the whole time, but he also didn't have any reason to believe he left the house for any length of time. Jim's ex-wife said that he was there when she came home between 8:30 or 8:45. He left shortly after she arrived home, stopping at the grocery store to buy cherries and a bottle of wine, and then he drove back to Carol's property. When he arrived, the police were already at the scene. So, Jim's alibi was pretty solid, but it's been pointed out with the various coverage of this case that he could have left his son at the house, drove to Carol's house, killed her, possibly because she spurned his advances, and then made it back to his ex's house before his son noticed. If you've ever seen an 11-year-old play a video game, you know they can hyper-focus, and you can see how maybe he wouldn't have noticed that his dad left. If Jim did this, it would have been risky since his kid could have noticed at any time that he left the house. But it was also a good choice because it looked like he had an alibi all night long. But what a lot of the coverage of this case leaves out, but is definitely included in the book Then No One Can Have Her, link in the description box, is the fact that Jim checked his voicemail at 7:58 p.m., just 1 minute before Carol's phone disconnected. And his phone pinged off the tower near his ex-wife's house. I have to assume it is frequently left out because it takes away a lot of the wonder about Jim Knapp as an alternative suspect. I've read the old comments on the 48 Hours and Dateline episodes on this case, and there are tons of commenters who think it's just so obvious Jim Knapp did it, and none of them know about this 7:58 use of his phone. What looked like a tight timeline to get to Carol's house, kill her around 8, and be back at his ex's house around 8:30-ish, looks absolutely impossible with this 7:58 checking of the voicemail. I will go ahead and add Jim's movements to the timeline of the day of the murder on the website, which I'll link in the show notes. And also there will be a new timeline posted this week of just the overall case progression. But basically, if you believe Carol hanging up on her mom happened right before she was killed, it takes Jim out of the running as a suspect entirely. And that's the timeline the investigators have stuck to. Later, we will play around with this timeline a little bit, but we're not quite there. It was in the early weeks that Jim was ruled out as far as the police were concerned, but he still didn't stop telling people that Steve killed Carol. He told them in person and through email, and sometimes he even included Carol's daughters on these emails, who were obviously still deep in their grief. This was very upsetting to them to get these emails, and around a month after the murder, they evicted him from the guest house. As the case was being built, things were only pointing in one direction, and that was towards Steve DeMocker. It would later be argued that everything pointed at Steve because that's the only place they were looking. Anything that pointed elsewhere got ignored. But let's go ahead and talk about the evidence they did find over the next several months and what they didn't find. For starters, they found out that Carol had 2 life insurance policies with the same company for a total of $750,000, with Steve as the beneficiary to then oversee the money for his daughters. This would be a big motive for anyone, but especially someone so deeply in debt with big spending habits. The investigators were in contact with the insurance company, and though Steve applied for the money, they had declined to pay it as he was a suspect. As for the bike tracks that they found behind Carol's house, they stopped behind a bush near the house, and the shoe prints continued on towards the house. They crossed over a barbed wire fence and headed towards her patio. Using photographs, the bike tire impressions were compared to Steve's bike. There were not a ton of fine details in the tracks because this was loose gravel, more sandy than anything, but they were consistent with Steve's tires, and there was nothing shown that would exclude them as a match. That said, there was really nothing to exclude any number of tires. There just really aren't a lot of variation in tire treads for bikes, and this was a major brand. The shoe prints proved to be a little more helpful. The FBI has access to something that is called Soulmate, very clever, and an article from 2007, which is around the time this case occurred, said that they had more than 12,000 shoes in the database for comparison. Using that, the FBI found that the prints came from the La Sportiva brand running shoe, and it was one of 3 styles. Only around 8,000 to 9,000 pairs in those styles had ever been sold. One style was called Pikes Peak, and it turned out that Steve had bought a pair of Pikes Peak running shoes in April 2006. The shoes were not found in his condo or garage, and when they asked Steve about them, he said he assumed he had long since gotten rid of them if he bought them 2 years before the murder. He did not have a memory of those specific shoes, but he was a serious runner, and he replaced his shoes every 6 months or so, which is common. He said he didn't tend to hold onto old ones for very long. So the police had the prints, and they had a record of the purchase, but not the actual shoes or even evidence Steve had them at the time of the murder. It's not like they had a photograph from 2 days before of him wearing those shoes. Now, the other evidence they had against Steve came from his computer. Early in 2008, Steve installed a program on his computer that masked his IP, deleted his internet history, and removed cookies. Steve said he installed this program because he sometimes looked at adult material, which was perfectly legal, but he had a teen daughter in the house. He didn't want her to accidentally stumble on something if she used his computer. The program, however, doesn't delete things fully. It just tells the computer that that file can be overwritten with new data. So the police were still able to find things on the computer when they searched it fully. They looked at the internet history, and they also ran a keyword search on the hard drive looking for any words related to the crime. And here's what they found. In March of 2008, Steve searched for, quote, use of carbon monoxide in suicide. This was interesting because twice in that same month, on the 3rd and the 14th, Steve's phone record showed that he called a chemical company. Then on May 7th, Steve put a partially completed order form for carbon monoxide in a folder on his computer labeled Book Research. He was unable to complete the form because you cannot buy carbon monoxide without an approved storage plan. On June 1st, 2008, a month before Carol's murder and the same day he had to pay her that first alimony check, Steve did 5 searches that caught the investigators' eye. At noon, he searched about payment of life insurance benefits in a homicide. Then for about a half hour in the evening, he searched tips from a hitman on how to kill someone, how to stage a suicide, how to kill and make it look like suicide, and how to make a homicide appear suicide. But the investigators also noticed something else. In the middle of making these searches, Steve visited a Writing World forum, and that would be Steve's explanation for all of these searches. He wasn't researching how to kill people because he was planning on murdering his ex-wife. He said it was for a mystery novel he wanted to write. It has been noted that there was no actual writing found on the computer, no short stories, outlines, pitch ideas, nothing like that. Just a folder of supposed research. And if Steve was just curious about these things for a novel, the police wondered why he would need to actually try and purchase carbon monoxide. And that's pretty much what they had against Steve. Let's talk about what they didn't have, and that is anything putting Steve at the scene of the crime. He put himself within a mile of the house riding his bike, but no one saw him or his bike near the house or behind it. They didn't find his fingerprints inside or outside, though I guess it's easy enough to wear gloves. But they also did not find any of Carol's blood on the clothes he came home in, his vehicle, his bike, his washing machine, or anything else. This was a pretty bloody crime scene, so it seemed incredible that he managed to transfer absolutely no blood anywhere. They also didn't find his blood or DNA at the house, even though they believed he cut himself on the fencing, and that's how he got all those scratches. So he may have had open wounds, yet still didn't transfer any of his DNA. Even worse for the police who were trying to build a case against Steve, they did find male DNA under Carol's nails, and it wasn't Steve's. They tested a bunch of people, including Jim Knapp and men Carol had met on dating sites, and they could not figure out whose DNA this was. All they knew at this point was that it was male, and it was handing any future defense team a plausible alternative suspect. The investigators really hoped to find something more definitive to put Steve DeMocker at that crime scene before they arrested him. But they didn't have it, so they looked at their case and decided to move forward anyway. On October 23, 2008, nearly 4 months after Carol's death, Steve was arrested at his office. And it's a good thing, too, because authorities would later learn that Steve, fearing an arrest was coming, made some pretty big moves towards fleeing. He first ordered some books about how to be a fugitive and how to protect personal privacy and cover his digital tracks. He also tried to get a new passport. The police had taken his, so on July 11th, he applied for a new one saying that his was lost. He had to give more information on the application as to the circumstances of losing his passport, and obviously Steve did not write that the police took it because he was a suspect in a murder investigation. Instead, he wrote that it was missing from the place he usually kept it, and he didn't know where it was. Then, on July 25th, Charlotte, his daughter, got into a car crash while driving Carol's car. When the insurance totaled the vehicle and sent a check, rather than giving over the $20,000 payment to the estate, which is where it legally belonged, he kept it and used it to purchase more things in his plan to flee. On August 2nd, Steve bought a motorcycle and loaded it with locked storage cases that were full with $15,000 in cash, a gun, and other provisions. He stored the motorcycle at his Scottsdale condo rather than his home in Prescott. Steve also told his daughter to buy him a prepaid cell phone and a GPS unit. Steve then gave her a code word in the event that the police showed up at the condo looking for him when he wasn't there. It would warn him that they were looking to arrest him soon. One night, Steve went for a walk with his girlfriend Renee and grabbed a bag on the way out the door. While walking near a golf course, he buried the bag. It was a go bag with clothing, more money, and a phone that he could just grab and leave on a moment's notice. Now, whether Steve didn't run because he changed his mind about it or whether he simply didn't realize they were that close to arresting him, we don't know. He was arrested before he could run, and he also agreed to answer some questions. One thing the investigators asked him about was the missing golf club cover. Steve admitted he had moved the cover when he cleaned his garage between the two searches. After he heard the investigators talking in hushed tones about golf clubs, he brought the cover to his attorney because he didn't know what he should do about it. He wasn't sure if it was relevant to the case. He didn't want to voluntarily just turn it over, but he also didn't want to throw it away. And after his arrest, when he learned it was relevant to the case, Steve's attorney did turn it over to the police. Steve was then held on a $2 million bond, well above what he or his family could afford, so he stayed in pretrial detention for what turned out to be a long time due to some pretty unusual pretrial issues. But before they even got that far, the case hit a stumbling block in the form of Arizona's Victims' Bill of Rights. It was passed by voters in 1990 as a constitutional amendment in the state, and it was meant to protect victims and their families from a lot of the issues we've seen come up before. Among the many rights that victims and their families were granted, they had a right to be kept informed by the state on what was happening with the case, and they were to be conferred with on various decisions like plea deals. The only way to be excluded from being protected by these rules, based on how the law was written, was if you were the defendant. So Steve, having been married to Carol for 25 years, was not protected by any of these rights, not because they were divorced, but because he stood accused of her murder. There was no provision in the law that would exclude victims or their family members who did not believe the defendant was guilty. So Carol's daughters were supporting Steve 100%, and the prosecution did not want to have to confer with them or consider their point of view when they moved ahead with their case. They argued that if the daughters kept in contact with their father, meaning they were waiving their right not to have contact with the defendant, then they were waiving the rest of their victims' rights. The girls did have their own attorney who argued that the state was just afraid they were going to pass information on to the defense, and that the prosecutors really couldn't pick and choose which victims they wanted the law to protect. They used this law when the victims were all for a conviction, but now they wanted to ignore it when they weren't. Not being considered victims under the Victims' Bill of Rights also meant that the two lost their rights to speak at various court hearings, including, if it came to it, giving victim impact statements. I definitely don't agree with this all-or-nothing approach to their rights, and I certainly feel for them with this. They were old enough to speak up for themselves, but still so young when all of this happened, and they had to navigate various issues that came up. And more of them did come up in this case as it got closer to trial. I have really never seen a situation where the victim's children or a defendant's child faced so much. But we're not to the trial yet, since two pretty big things happened prior to it, and the first was that Jim Knapp, Carol's friend and the defense's best bet for a reasonable alternative suspect, died. It was January 7th, 2009, when Jim's ex called his friends to let them know that he missed a visit with his kids, and she wondered if they had heard from him. They hadn't, so they went out to the condo where he was staying just to check up on him. When they got there, they found the glass from a front window was on the landing, and the door was mostly open. On entering, they saw a shell casing on the ground, and then they saw a second shell casing, while also noticing that the bedroom door was closed. They backed out of the apartment and called the police. When the authorities arrived, they entered the bedroom and they found Jim lying on the floor halfway into the closet. He had a single gunshot wound to the chest, and a 9mm semi-automatic gun was laying on the floor near his left hip. The police searched the condo and found a total of 5 shell casings and 4 bullet holes. The broken window had been shot from inside the condo, and there were no signs of a break-in. After an investigation, Jim's death was ruled a suicide. He had been under a lot of stress since Carol's death. On top of his own grief, he was evicted from the guest house, and he had few options of where to go. He had trouble keeping a job, and most of what he had was thanks to the charity of friends. As he had told them, he was battling stage 4 skin cancer. It would turn out that this was an exaggeration. Jim had been diagnosed with skin cancer, but it wasn't an aggressive form like melanoma. It was like a basal cell or a squamous cell carcinoma. I had a basal cell carcinoma in my late 20s, and the treatment is, for 85 to 95% of people, completely cured through removal. And it isn't the type to spread to organs. But a lot of his friends, including Carol, believed he had aggressive cancer. Because Jim didn't have steady work, he only had about $200 to his name at the time of his death, and he had recently lost parenting time with his boys. Due to his prescription drug use, he had to submit to a drug test to have them in the car with him or to keep them overnight. He had refused the most recent test, so he was only allowed to see them supervised at his ex-wife's house. The police believe Jim shot the gun around the condo for some reason before he turned it on himself. When reporting on suicides, it's recommended not to talk about specific methods due to the issues with contagion. But the method matters here because some believe Jim's death wasn't a suicide. Who shoots up a condo first? It looked to some people, not necessarily the police, but there's definitely discourse around the idea that someone, possibly the person who had killed Carol, had also killed Jim. And that matters for two reasons. First, Steve DeMocker was locked up, so he couldn't have killed Jim. And two, well, that brings us to the second big thing that happened before trial. Steve DeMocker heard, through an air vent in his cell, that Carol was killed by drug associates of Jim's. The air vents were and are a popular way for inmates to talk to each other when they're locked in their cells. Steve said he was told through these air vents that it was two men from Phoenix who murdered Carol. Steve wrote down what he heard and told it to his attorney in May of 2009. Now, this really wouldn't mean much coming from a defendant that he heard these mystery voices through the air vents, but this tip then came in through another avenue. On June 19th, 2009, about a year before the trial would finally start, Steve's attorney got an email from an anonymous tipster telling a very similar story. The email tipster claimed that Jim Knapp had told Carol about a prescription drug deal/ring he was involved in. It pointed out that Jim and Carol would drink wine and talk, which would have been when he told her about it. Someone had found out about it, and 3 people, 2 men and a woman, were sent out to the property to kill both of them to shut them up. It was supposed to look like a home invasion gone wrong, and they came armed with a police baton and the handle of an axe. According to the tip, the woman stayed out front to keep watch while the men went to the back bedroom where they thought both Jim and Carol would be. When they got in there, they realized it was just Carol and that she was on the phone with someone. Carol tried to get out of the house, but they caught her and there was a fight, and she was beaten to death. Since Carol had been on the phone, they worried that the police would soon come, so they left in a rush, leaving the baton behind and leaving the axe handle near a fence. They had tried to go back for the weapons, but the police were already there. It wasn't until the next day that they got both of them and threw them away. The email also said that Jim was not killed by these same people, but Carol's killers were major drug suppliers in Phoenix. The defense attorney getting the email alerted the prosecutors to it and said it was consistent with a story that Steve had heard while in lockup. The investigators were able to trace the email back to an internet cafe in Phoenix. Now, the email address that the email came from had been created that day, so that didn't give any clues as to who sent it. And the cafe also didn't have cameras or any type of login system to indicate who used that computer. The police did a search of the usage of the computer prior to the email being sent and noticed something interesting. The person who sent the email had done searches for the prosecutor's email address, and it was a search for a prosecutor who had only recently come on the case, which few people would have even been aware of at that point. Only people following the case very closely would have been aware of the change in prosecutor. The other notable thing was that in spite of searching for the prosecutor's email address, the emailer did not search for the defense attorney's email. They knew that piece of information. So this email came from someone who knew about the new prosecutor coming on board and knew the defense attorney's email address without having to look it up. Now that sounded like it was coming from someone on Steve's side. Steve was interviewed about this, and he denied having told anyone except his attorney about what he heard through the air vent. But the investigators didn't believe him. They pulled his recorded jailhouse calls to his girlfriend Renee and to his daughters, and focused on the time between when the air vent story was first told to his attorney in May and when the email was sent. Now, without the context of the emails, the calls would have sounded vaguely cryptic, but once you have that piece, they were pretty transparent. On June 1st, Steve called Renee and told her that she needed to bring Charlotte with her for a visit the next day with paper and pen in hand. He had some info for them. They did visit, according to the logs, on the 2nd. Then on June 4th, Steve called Charlotte to talk to her more about what he called the task. He said he had a new cellmate who could explain how to get it done. On June 18th, after another visit, Steve called Charlotte and asked if she was, quote, running errands the next day, and she said yes. The following morning, he called again, and she said she was going to do the errands and would be back around 6 p.m. He said he would call her then. Now, that was the day the email was sent. He called his girlfriend Renee around 6 p.m., and she said Charlotte had gone clothes shopping, and he asked how it went, and Renee said it went well. So at this point, the police are believing that it was likely Charlotte who wrote the email. They had sent the email to the FBI for analysis, and they got some confirmation of what they thought. The first thing the FBI said was that this was consistent with being someone who knew Carol already because of the detail about Jim and Carol often sitting down and chatting while drinking wine. That wasn't the sort of detail that an uninterested third party would talk about when sharing gossip. The FBI had also taken emails written by Renee, Charlotte, and Katie to compare writing style, and the analysis showed that the writing was most like Charlotte's. While continuing to try to find solid evidence that the email did come from Charlotte, the police tried to dismiss the voice in the vent story that Steve told. The entire jail isn't connected through these vents, so there was a limited number of cells that someone could talk in that Steve would have been able to hear. They checked all of those inmates for any connection to Jim Knapp and found none. They also interviewed several inmates, but the only one who knew anything about Jim Knapp was the one who heard Steve tell the story about Jim being wrapped up in this drug ring. The defense, though, in spite of the iffy nature of this email, still wanted to use it at trial while the state objected to it. And that was just one of the several evidentiary issues the judge had to deal with, and we really just can't get into all of them here because of how long these two parts are already and how much further we still have to go. The trial finally started in June of 2010, nearly 2 years after Carol's murder. Jury selection in this case took a while because it was a death penalty case, so potential jurors were not just interviewed about being unbiased in the case, but also in the penalty phase. However, after they went through all of that and made sure they impaneled an unbiased jury that would not immediately jump for or oppose a death sentence, the state ended up dropping the death penalty. They said it was at the insistence of the family. During opening statements, the state told the jury that this case was about money. Steve resented the divorce settlement, he was in bad financial shape, and he had to pay Carol $6,000 a month for the next 8 years. That would total over $500,000 out of his pocket and into hers. To stop those payments and to get his ex-wife's life insurance payout, he killed her. The defense then gave their opening and said that money was not a motive here. Steve's business had the downturn that everyone else in the industry faced, but he had no reason to believe he couldn't recover. And as for the life insurance, Steve actually disclaimed his interest in it so that his daughters could collect. He wouldn't have done that if he wanted the money. This opening statement was news to the prosecution. They knew that Steve had tried to claim the life insurance money 5 times, in fact, and he was denied every single time. They had followed up with the life insurance company who confirmed repeatedly that he didn't collect. But for some reason, they were never alerted when the insurance paid out to his daughters. So while the trial was underway, the state sent an investigator on the trail of that insurance money. And what they found was that Steve did directly benefit from that insurance money in spite of how his attorney portrayed it. The oldest daughter, Katie, was the executor of Carol's estate, and the money was paid out to her and Charlotte, with money going into trust for Charlotte since she wasn't 18 yet. In a recorded jailhouse phone call with Katie, Steve told her that he needed that money to pay his lawyer. He needed all of it, every dime. And Katie said no. She was pretty assertive about it, and I don't know that I could have, at her age and with everything she was going through, stood up to a parent this much. Katie did not oppose using the money to pay for the attorney, but only after they put money aside for Charlotte's college fund. She told Steve straight out that as executor, she was representing her mom, and that's what her mom would want, to make sure Charlotte's education was covered no matter what. Steve argued that his life was on the line as the state was still seeking the death penalty at that point, and his literal life was more important than Charlotte's college. Plus, if he had a good attorney, he was more likely to be found not guilty and could come home, being able to work and pay the tuition himself. But Katie was still just focused on protecting her sister's future in all of this. Eventually, Katie did decide to spend her share of the money on her father's defense. She sent the money to her grandparents, who then paid the attorneys. Steve's girlfriend, Renee, who had taken over as Charlotte's guardian, then took over as trustee of Charlotte's money until she turned 18. And when Charlotte got control of her money, it was also sent to her grandparents, who then paid it to the defense team. The state would claim that people had breached their duties by funneling the insurance money through the girls to Steve's parents and then to the defense attorneys. The defense countered that this money was Katie and Charlotte's, and if they wanted to spend it on defense attorneys, it was up to them. And while I agree with it being up to them, I also think that the daughters were pressured into giving their money to their father's defense. If not pressured by actual people, they were definitely pressured by the circumstances. I do wish they had some third-party advisement here. Obviously, the people involved in this who they could talk to, which was like Steve, their grandparents, his attorney, his girlfriend, all had a vested interest in Steve's well-being. This money would end up only benefiting the attorneys in the long run due to what happened next. On the 8th day of testimony, the judge called an early lunch. He didn't say why, but it was because he was not feeling well. He went back to his chambers and collapsed. They initially thought he had a heart attack, but it turned out he had a brain tumor and his condition was terminal. The trial was recessed for several weeks while a new judge was assigned and got caught up. When the trial was about to resume, Steve and Renee broke up, and the investigators thought that Renee probably had a lot of information she might be willing to share with this change in relationship. They didn't know this, but Renee had been consulting with a friend who was a minister about what she knew and what she should do about it. She was finding some parts of Steve's story from the night of the murder odd. She knew him to be very organized and prepared when going on outdoor adventures, so she thought it was unusual that he didn't have a tire patch kit with him. But he was new to mountain biking, so maybe he just didn't think of it. But then she also never ever knew Steve to have his phone battery die. He had backup batteries so that it would never happen. She seemed to have a hard time thinking he was capable of killing anyone, but there were points in his story that did concern her. So on September 19th, 2010, Renee sat down with the police and had already decided to be open and forthright. But after immunity was granted on the 3 main points she discussed. One was what happened to the life insurance money, and another was in regards to knowing about the go bag that Steve had hidden in a golf course, which she led police to. And the third point was that email. Renee told the police that when she and Charlotte went to visit Steve a couple weeks before the email was sent, he held up a piece of paper to the glass partition between them. On that paper was written the story about the drug ring he supposedly heard about through the vent. Charlotte wrote down what was said at Steve's insistence, and Steve said that no one would believe him if he told the story, so he needed it to come from someone on the outside. Renee initially told Charlotte she wasn't going to send the tip in and didn't think Charlotte should either, but eventually she backed off. She thought Charlotte needed her dad home, and Renee was overwhelmed and wanted Steve home too, so she didn't stop Charlotte from doing it. In fact, she helped her a little bit, giving her the gas money to drive to Phoenix. Charlotte powered down her cell phone before she left so she couldn't be traced to Phoenix. She parked down the street from the cafe so that no one would connect her car with the location, And when she got to the internet cafe, she paid for her computer usage in cash. When Charlotte couldn't find the prosecutor's email address online, she just sent it to the defense. With the confirmation that Charlotte sent the email at Steve's direction, each side of this trial reversed their positions on that email and its admissibility. Suddenly, the state was arguing to let it in, and the defense was arguing why it should be excluded. And this really highlights that adversarial system we have. Wanting this email in at trial has less to do with if it's admissible and more to do with whether it supports your side. Countries with trials that are more focused on fact-finding don't quite deal with this to the same degree. The state also wanted to talk to Charlotte, and they offered her immunity for any charges related to sending the email. They viewed her as a victim of her father, and they had no interest in prosecuting her. However, on the advice of her attorney, the scheduled sit-down interview was canceled. Though the state was willing to give Renee and Charlotte immunity, they certainly weren't giving it to Steve. He was charged with forgery, fraud, tampering with evidence, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Steve would admit to everything in regards to Charlotte sending the email, justifying it by saying that he was terrified of being wrongfully convicted. But he insisted that the voice in the vent was real. The prosecution was now investigating the defense team for two issues. One was if there was anything improper about using the insurance money to pay their legal fees. The lead attorney had been a witness on some of the documents, so it wasn't like they simply collected money without knowledge of where it came from. That alone wouldn't have been too big of a deal, but now they were being investigated about the email. It was the good old what did they know and when did they know it scenario. It seems like they did not know the email was sent at the direction of their client. They had asked Renee straight out if she knew anything about it, and she lied to them and said no. She said this, too, was at the direction of Steve, who said she should not discuss it with anyone except him and Charlotte, and that included his defense team. The defense was saying that they, too, had been deceived. Even the email situation alone probably could have been overcome, but it was really these two issues together that had the attorneys defending themselves over their own client's behavior. That had them motion to withdraw from the case due to the conflict of interest. On November 5th, 2010, this was granted. Steve now had no attorney and no money since it was all paid to this team. With this, the judge was forced to declare a mistrial. Steve was then considered indigent, but the public defender's office was unable to defend him due to some other conflict of interest, so new lawyers from outside the public defender's office had to be pulled in. And then there were more delays as they approached the second trial. In May of 2011, the defense filed a motion to dismiss the case with prejudice, meaning they can't file it again, based on prosecutorial misconduct. It's my understanding that they were accusing the state of viewing ex parte applications that they weren't supposed to see. Ex parte means they're filed by one party without the other side getting notice or being given the ability to respond. These were filed and accessible through the county attorney's office, but because they were marked ex parte, the state wasn't supposed to look at them. The office claimed that there was a computer glitch that marked several documents ex parte when they weren't, and they had to click on them to see if they really were. According to the state, the files were clicked on, and then when it was clear they were ex parte, they were closed again. All they would have seen was that top part where the case number, the parties, and all that info is, but nothing of substance. The defense said that was not true. The system logged when the files were accessed, and they said these documents were viewed dozens of times. The judge rejected the motion to dismiss the case, so the defense appealed, of course. The Court of Appeals ordered the trial court to have an evidentiary hearing, which then started in December 2012 and took a while. So it really wasn't until April 2013 that it was clear there would be another trial. Jury selection for that trial started on July 16th, 2013, 5 years after Carol's death. The only good thing about these delays, from the state's point of view, was that it allowed time for the identification of the mysterious DNA under Carol's fingernails. One of the investigators had the thought that they should check the DNA of males who had been autopsied in the same room before Carol was. What if this was just an issue of cross-contamination? And that's exactly what it was. A 68-year-old man whose autopsy was conducted earlier in the day was a match to the DNA under Carol's fingernails. This was good for the state in that it took away the mysterious alternative suspect, which the defense would certainly have leveraged. But it also helped the defense in their assertion that this investigation was sloppy. Because that wasn't the only thing about Carol's autopsy and handling of her body that was questionable. In a pretty shocking admission, the ME said he wanted an expert to look at Carol's head wounds. So he put her body in a body bag, tied it down in the back of his pickup truck, and drove it to Phoenix. This type of behavior only muddies the waters. Now, for the second trial, we're just going to hit the highlights since we've already covered almost all of the evidence presented. One issue that came up was that there was not a documented history of violence in the marriage, and the defense planned to use that as evidence. According to pretty much everyone, the only thing ever witnessed that could be classified as violence between Carol and Steve was when Carol threw a box at him during an argument. Steve's business assistant / girlfriend Barb testified that he did lose his temper on her twice, once getting in her face and another time pounding his fists on the desk and storming off, but he never put his hands on her. There were some reports from Carol that she was afraid of Steve, that he went off on her at some times, and even that she would only meet him in public places because she was worried for her safety, but no one witnessed anything themselves. The closest the state could get to proving violence in the marriage was an email from May 8th, 2007, when Carol emailed Steve directly. In the email, she wrote about an incident where he came to the house, grabbed her phone from her hand, and threw it against the wall before shoving her. Steve wrote back calling her a liar and saying that her retelling of that argument was incorrect. Whether this email would be allowed in at trial was a debate. It was prejudicial as it asserted that Steve had grabbed her phone and threw it, and that was similar to what they believed happened on the night of the murder. The killer grabbed the phone and hung up on Ruth. The defense and the prosecution ended up stipulating that the May 8th email would not come in unless the defense insisted on presenting that there was no history of violence as evidence. One of the hardest parts of this trial is that both daughters had to testify. Charlotte had to testify about the email because she was granted immunity, therefore didn't have to worry about incriminating herself through her testimony. Both of the daughters were poised. They testified with integrity, which was a lot to ask of them. Obviously, they wanted justice for their mom, but they didn't think this trial was going to lead to it. They continued to support Steve's innocence. The defense did score some good points with the ME on the stand, including getting him to concede that the murder weapon could have been a golf club, but he didn't rule out other weapons. And he couldn't even say that it was only one weapon that was used. It could have been more than one. The defense then really attacked this investigation, including pointing out all the alternative suspects that hadn't been fully looked at, like Barb and even one of Carol's ex-boyfriends. Now, calling him an ex-boyfriend may be overstating things. She had met a man named John on a dating app, and they talked for a while before she broke things off completely on May 14th, 2008, when she and her boyfriend from Maine were getting more serious. Her farewell email has been described as terse. John was asked for a DNA sample, and he lawyered up immediately and did not want to comply. The police then looked at where he was at the time, and he may have been in the area. According to the book, Then No One Can Have Her, using bank and phone records, the investigators found that he was in California from July 1st through the 3rd, and one of the places he was Blythe, which is only 3 hours from Prescott. He was then in Scottsdale on July 4th. It appears he may have called Carol's house on the morning of her murder from a phone with the Phoenix area code. How or if he was fully ruled out is unclear. The defense pointed out how the police didn't get bank records from either Barb or John, which may have given them more information. But Barb and John were just examples of possible suspects not ruled out because the police had tunnel vision on Steve. The real person they were talking about was Jim Knapp. They said there was more evidence linking Jim to the crime scene than there was linking Steve to it. The most the state had were those shoe prints and the bike tire marks, which were only allowed to be presented as similar to. The sandy gravel is not great for holding impressions, and the photos lacked sufficient detail to truly match the tire treads. And as for the shoe, they were only matching a type of shoe that Steve once bought. They never found the shoes to do a direct comparison. On the other hand, Jim's fingerprint was found on banking documents in Carol's house that had been printed on the day of the murder and tucked into a magazine. The theory was that Jim, who had hoped Carol would use her divorce settlement to go into business with him, saw the documents when he was in the house that day. Carol, who had turned him down on this business deal, had the 401k money in her account. While a chunk of it was going to go to taxes and debt, Jim may not have known that. Feeling lied to and betrayed when Carol wouldn't go into business claiming she couldn't afford it, Jim went back to Carol's house, killed her, running off to get back to his ex-wife's house before his absence was noticed. One issue with this, for me, was that the documents weren't collected into evidence on the day of the murder. It was a different search of the house on a different day that someone noticed a reddish substance on the magazine. It turned out not to be blood, but Jim had been using the house's laundry room, like he always did, when he was allowed back in the house after the murder. So it's possible he snooped through that paperwork after the murder and had not known about that money before. But this was still one more fingerprint of Jim's than they had of Steve's in the house, and it was another chance to show that the police didn't really look into Jim through a critical lens. They let him back into Carol's house while they were still gathering evidence. They also had Jim's DNA in the house, which could be explained by his frequent visits with Carol, but some of it was found mixed with Carol's blood on the doorknob leading to the garage. That doesn't mean it was left there the same time, but again, it's more DNA than they had on Steve. There really is no denying that the way Jim was treated was different than how Steve was treated, and that this began on the night of the murder. Jim was not taken to the station for questioning, and he was escorted to the guest home to pick up some belongings for the night. This was before they fully vetted his alibi, so it seems like they were already suspecting Steve and not pursuing other suspects. And let's go ahead and get into Jim's alibi. He did have a pretty solid one. He had a point in his timeline where he checked his voicemail at 7:58, and it pinged off a tower near his ex-wife's house. But the defense argued that all we know is that Carol said, "Oh no," and then her phone disconnected at 7:59. That doesn't mean that's when she was killed. The defense argued that her dogs regularly had accidents in the home, and the "oh no" could have been because she walked in on a mess. Stains were found when the crime scene investigators pulled up the carpet, so it's possible. If we push the time of death out as any time between 8 p.m. and until the first deputy arrived at 8:52, and we say Jim's ex didn't get back until the latest point in her timeline of 8:45, Jim could have checked his voicemail, left his ex's house, killed Carol, and then returned back undetected. Because he wasn't investigated that night, he didn't have to get rid of any evidence. He could have done it the next day or the day after or the day after that. This timeline is still incredibly tight, and it relies on his 11-year-old being completely unaware Jim left that night. But it was within the realm of possibility. I think it was unlikely, but possible. The state countered that if Carol was simply cleaning up a dog's mess, why didn't she tell her mom she had to go and say goodbye? Why didn't she answer the phone when her mom immediately called back? Logic dictated that the "oh no," the phone disconnecting, and then Carol's murder were all just one continuous string of events. The defense reminded the jury on closing that they didn't have to prove that Jim Knapp did it. That wasn't their burden. But when you compared the evidence against Steve to the evidence against Jim, they said there was more against Jim. So what was the evidence against Steve? For sure, there was a motive. Steve wanted/needed money, and Carol was the obstacle to getting that. He did look up some suspicious things for his alleged book, but as the defense pointed out, nothing he looked up really related to how Carol's murder was actually carried out. It wasn't staged as a suicide, and carbon monoxide was not involved. The murder weapon was assumed to be a golf club, but that wasn't conclusive, and the club or the murder weapon was never found. But let's go ahead and say the murder weapon was definitely a golf club, and Steve knew the golf club cover belonged to the murder weapon. So why did he give it to his attorney? If he knew it could connect him to the murder, why didn't he get rid of it if the state is saying he got rid of all this other evidence? This case is not the most circumstantial case I've seen go to trial for sure, so I'm not surprised that charges were brought. But it is circumstantial enough that I'm also not surprised that the defense got in a lot of good points about the holes in the case. The jury took the case to deliberate, and on October 4th, 2013, their verdict was in. They found Steve DeMocker guilty of first-degree murder and of other charges related to the use of the life insurance money and the fraudulent email. At sentencing, the victim impact statements were given, though Katie and Charlotte did not give them as they were still not considered victims under the law. Instead, they spoke on their father's behalf, and they were able to speak a little bit about their mom in those statements. They still did not believe their father was guilty and asked that he be allowed a chance at parole. Steve spoke, saying that he did not kill Carol and he wasn't capable of it. Justice was not served, and the wrong man was convicted. The state disagreed, calling him a murdering, lying thief, and the judge sided with the state. He pointed out the horrific crime scene and the premeditated nature of the murder. For the murder, Steve was sentenced to life without parole. He was then sentenced to about 20 years for all the other charges, and he was ordered to pay back the money he took from Carol's estate. That included the life insurance payouts that went to his first set of attorneys, but also the insurance money from the car wreck that he took, and additional money he used to clean the house to prepare it for sale. Seeing as inmates aren't allowed to earn much money, this payback is just never going to happen. Steve DeMocker was then sent to prison. He has appealed, but those attempts as of the most recent decision in 2021 have been denied. Steve is currently serving his time in Douglas, Arizona in a medium security unit, and he and his family still maintain his innocence. I decided to cover this case prior to the news that Scott Peterson's case was being picked up by the LA Innocence Project, but as I have been going over everything here, I can't help but see the parallel in these cases. Not about who I think is guilty or innocent, but about the confusion on the evidence and the arguments that not all avenues were pursued. And if you feel torn on this case, I definitely recommend the book, Then No One Can Have Her by Caitlin Rother. Maybe one of the details I didn't include is the one that helps you make up your mind. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfourproductions.com/support.